Hello, and welcome to Cogito Ergo Pod, the show where we discuss, delve, and dissect theology, philosophy, mysticism, and the esoteric. I'm your host, Daniel, and I'm so glad you're here. Before we dive into the deep end of cosmic mysteries today, a quick reminder. If you enjoy our deep dives into the ancient world, please make sure to follow and support the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to right now. It really helps the show to grow. And for extra doses of esoteric history, philosophical memes, and behind-the-scenes clips, go find us over on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube at Cogito Ergo Pod. Now, imagine walking into a Christian church in 2nd century Rome. The liturgy feels familiar, the scriptures read are somewhat recognizable, and the people are welcoming. But after the main service, a select group gather in a private room. There they speak of a hidden cosmos, a flawed creator god, and a divine feminine entity who fell from grace, and a secret knowledge that can liberate the divine spark trapped inside your physical body. This wasn't a completely different religion, it was a highly influential, deeply philosophical movement within early Christianity. This episode will be the first in a series, which I suspect may go on for a few episodes, focusing on different sects within the Gnostic Christian tradition. If you look back in the episodes, you'll find that I did an overview of what Gnosticism was, but now I feel is a good enough time as any to deep dive into some of the particular sects, groups, individuals, and rituals associated with them. Today, we are exploring the brilliant mind of Valentinus and the fascinating, beautiful, and ultimately suppressed world of Valentinian Gnosticism. To understand the theology, we have to understand the man. Valentinus is arguably the most brilliant theologian that mainstream history tried to forget. He was born around 100 CE in Phrebonis, Egypt, and received a top-tier education in Alexandria, which was the intellectual melting pot of the ancient world. This is crucial because Alexandria was where Jewish theology, early Christian thought, and Greek Platonism crashed into each other. Valentinus was deeply influenced by this mix. He claimed to have been a student of Theodos, who was supposedly a direct disciple of the Apostle Paul. Around 136 CE, Valentinus packed his bags and moved to Rome, the heart of the empire. He wasn't an outsider throwing stones at the church. He was a prominent, highly respected member of the Roman Christian community. He was a gifted orator and a sublime poet. In fact, the early Christian writer Tertullian notes, with a bit of historical sass, that Valentinus was so brilliant and eloquent that he was actually a prime candidate to become the Bishop of Rome, what we would now call the Pope. But he was passed over for the position, allegedly in favour of a martyr. Tertullian claims that out of indignation, Valentinus broke away to form his own sect. Modern historians, however, think that's an oversimplification. Valentinus didn't see himself as breaking away. He believed he was teaching the deep, inner mysteries of the faith that ordinary believers just weren't ready for yet. So, what did the Valentinians actually believe? Strap in, because Valentinian cosmology is a grand, beautiful, and highly complex mythic drama. At the absolute peak of reality is the primal source, the ultimate god, often called Bethos, meaning depth, or the monad. This entity is completely ineffable, invisible, and incomprehensible. For incomprehensible eons, Bethos exists in silent contemplation alongside a feminine counterpart, Siga, or silence. From this divine couple, a series of emanations flow outward. These divine beings are called Aeons, and they represent different aspects of the divine mind, like mind, truth, word, and life. They exist in male-female pairs, 30 Aeons altogether. This divine realm of fullness is called the Pleroma, literally fullness. The drama begins with the youngest of the Aeons, Sophia, whose name means wisdom. Sophia experiences an intense, passionate desire to know the incomprehensible ultimate Father directly. But this desire violates the cosmic order. The Father can only be known through the proper hierarchy. In her passion and anguish, Sophia experiences a crisis that fractures her. She inadvertently gives birth to a deformed, incomplete entity. Shamed, she hides this creature outside the Pleroma. This entity is the Demiurge, the fashioner or architect of our physical universe. The Valentinians identified the Demiurge as the god of the Old Testament. Crucially, unlike other Gnostic groups, such as the Scythians, who viewed the Demiurge as actively evil and malicious, Valentinus viewed him as merely ignorant and foolish. The Demiurge thinks he is the only god. He doesn't realize he is just a middleman, building a material world that blindly copies the spiritual blueprints of the Pleroma. But here is the twist. When the Demiurge breathes life into humanity, a tiny drop of Sophia's divine essence, a spark of pure spirit, slips into human beings without the Demiurge even realizing it. We are physical bodies created by a flawed architect, but inside us sits a piece of the ultimate divine fullness. Therefore, salvation isn't about being saved from sin. In the traditional legal sense, it's about awakening from amnesia. It is achieving through gnosis and experiential, intuitive knowledge of who we are, where we came from, and how we can return to the Pleroma. Jesus, in the Valentinian view, is a divine Aeon sent from the Pleroma to bring this awakening knowledge to humanity. As you can imagine, this didn't go down overly well with the bishops who were trying to build a unified, standardized Christian church. The main sources we have on Valentinus for centuries came from his fiercest critics, the heresiologists or heresy hunters. The most famous of these was Irenaeus of Lyon, who around 180 CE wrote a massive 5-volume work titled Adversus Heresis, against heresies. Irenaeus spent the entire first volume laying out Valentinian theology just to tear it down. He mocked their complex genealogies of Aeons, famously joking that if God can emanation worship like this, why not invent Aeons called gourd or melon? But behind the mockery was genuine fear. Valentinus's movement was incredibly popular, especially among the educated elite. What made it terrifying to church leaders like Irenaeus and Tertullian was that Valentinians didn't start a separate church. They attended regular Orthodox services, communion, and looked like ordinary Christians. But afterwards, they would gather secretly to discuss the higher mysteries. Tertullian wrote an entire treatise against them, noting that they were like a multi-headed hydra, subtly shifting their doctrines depending on who they were talking to. The Orthodox leaders realized that if Valentinianism won the theological war, Christianity would become an esoteric, elitist mystery school, rather than a universal religion, open to all people, regardless of intellectual pedigree. By the late 2nd and 3rd centuries, the institutional church began tightening its grip. Bishops insisted on a strict rule of faith, a single creed, and a set canon of scriptures. The multi-layered, fluid interpretations of the Valentinians were increasingly pushed out. The final blow came in the 4th century, when the Roman Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. The power of the state was thrown behind the Orthodox bishops. In 326 CE, Constantine issued an edict explicitly banning heretical meetings, including those of the Valentinians. Their meeting houses were confiscated, and their books were systematically hunted down and burned. To possess a Valentinian text was to risk execution or exile. By the 5th century, the movement had completely vanished from the historical record, fading away into a footnote written by the very enemies who destroyed it. For nearly 1,600 years, we only knew about Valentinus through the biased, mocking descriptions of Irenaeus and Tertullian. But history has a funny way of refusing to stay buried. In December 1945, near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a local peasant dug up a sealed earthenware jar. Inside were 3 papyrus codices containing over 50 texts, an absolute treasure trove of lost Gnostic Gospels. Among them were beautiful texts like the Gospel of Truth and the Tripartite Tractate, which scholars believe were written by Valentinus himself or his immediate disciples. When we read these primary texts today, they completely upend the traditional view of Gnosticism as a wild, erratic heresy. Instead of the chaotic, fragmented system described by their enemies, the Nag Hammadi texts revealed an incredibly sophisticated, unified, and deeply psychological theology. Take the Gospel of Truth, which many prominent scholars believe was penned by Valentinus himself. It isn't a narrative gospel with a plot line or miracles, and it doesn't contain a list of secret sayings. It is actually a beautifully poetic, moving sermon. The Gospel of Truth completely reframes the human condition. Salvation isn't about escaping an inherence of legalistic sin. It's a healing from a state of psychological trauma. The text describes human existence without gnosis as a terrifying nightmare of panic, confusion, and darkness, where we are chased by illusions. Jesus comes to earth not to pay a blood debt to an angry deity, but to act as a teacher who shines a light, waking humanity up from this cosmic nightmare. Then you have the Tripartite Tractate, a massive, systematic theological work, likely written by a later generation of the Valentinian school. This text gives us a masterclass in how intellectually rigorous this movement really was. Crucially, it taught us that Valentinianism was far more optimistic than other Gnostic groups. While other sects explicitly hated the material world and viewed it as a demonic prison, the Tripartite Tractate presents a more monistic view. It explains that the material world isn't an inherently evil trap, but a necessary training ground for the soul. Furthermore, it outlines a grand cosmic evolution. It teaches that the spiritual fracture will not end in destruction, but in universal restoration, with my favorite word, apokatastasis. Eventually, everything, including human spirits, the material universe, and even that ignorant Demiurge himself, will be healed, reconciled, and integrated back into the absolute unity of the ultimate Father. Where have we heard something like that before? Perhaps Origen? Ultimately, these texts proved that Valentinian Gnosticism wasn't just bizarre myth-making designed to shock people. It was a brilliant, early Christian psychology wrapped in the language of myth, exploring the deep human yearning for identity, meaning, and connection to the divine. Valentinus wasn't trying to destroy Christianity. He was trying to explore its deeper psychological and mystical dimensions. It makes you wonder, how different would the Western world look today if the man who almost became Pope had actually succeeded and Christianity had embraced the search for the inner spark rather than institutional conformity? That is all for today's episode of Cogito Ergo Pod. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today exploring the Pleroma. If this episode got your cognitive gears turning, please take a brief moment to leave us a rating or review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. It makes a world of difference for an independent show like this. Don't forget to follow our social channels on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Cogito Ergo Pod for more historical and theological deep dives throughout the week. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning. I'll speak to you again next time.